The trip back to Clayton was a violent decompression, a journey through a cultural vacuum that Jacob Barnes felt in his bones. On the civilian bus, surrounded by the noise of normal life, the ringing of cell phones, the laughter, the conversations about weekend plans, he was an anachronism. His body, trained for economy of movement and constant readiness, felt trapped and restless in the cramped seat. His civilian clothes, a pair of jeans and a t-shirt that were once his skin, now felt like a flimsy costume, the soft fabric offering a false sense of security. He looked out the window, but he didn't see the landscape with the eyes of a tourist. He saw it with the mind of an infantryman. The bridges that crossed the Ohio rivers were no longer picturesque structures, but tactical choke points, vulnerable to ambush. The dense forests lining the highway were not an invitation to nature, but areas of cover and concealment. His mind, reconditioned by months of training to see the world as a potential battlefield, could no longer turn off the threat assessment filter. The noise of the civilian world was the most disorienting. The overlapping conversations, the easy laughter, the loud music, all formed a cacophony of normality from which he no longer felt a part. He was a stranger in his own land, a man who had learned a secret language of violence and discipline and who now found the common language of peace and triviality almost impossible to comprehend. The anticipation of seeing his family was a sharp pain in his chest, a mixture of a deep longing for belonging and the terrifying certainty that he might never truly belong again. The homecoming was an exercise in estrangement. His childhood home, which in his memories at the barracks had become a mythological sanctuary of comfort and safety, now seemed to have shrunk, its walls containing a rarefied air of unspoken emotions. His mother, Mary's, hug was a collision of love and panic. She clung to him with the force of someone trying to stop a tide from dragging him out to sea. Her face buried in his chest, her silent sobs a quiet accusation against the world that was stealing him. His father, Michael's hug, in contrast, was a brief and rigid contact, the embrace of a man who only knew how to express love through restraint. Upon entering his old room, Jake felt like an archaeologist, discovering the ruins of a lost civilization. The football trophies on his shelf, the faded band posters on the wall, all seemed to belong to a boy he barely recognized, a friendly ghost from a past life. The distance between the man he was now and the boy he had been was a distance measured not in time, but in experience, an unbridgeable chasm. He was home, surrounded by the love of his family, but the loneliness he felt was deeper and more penetrating than any loneliness he had felt on the dark nights at Fort Polk. He was an actor in a play about his own return, and the feeling of fraud was overwhelming. The first family dinner was a carefully orchestrated ritual of denial. Mary, in a frantic effort to invoke the spirit of the past and banish the specter of the future, cooked a feast. The kitchen table, the center of their family life, was laden with Jake's childhood favorites: roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans with bacon. It was a barricade of comfort food, an attempt to use nostalgia as a shield against reality. The conversation floated gently on the surface of life, carefully avoiding any depth. They talked about the neighbor's new car, about the drought threatening the local corn crops, about a distant cousin who was getting married. They talked about everything except for the one thing that filled the room: the war. The name Iraq hung in the air, unsaid, but present in every silence, in every exchanged glance. Jake answered the questions in monosyllables, his mind struggling to engage in a dialogue that seemed to belong to a parallel universe. How could he talk about the drought in Ohio when his mind was busy rehearsing procedures for the desert heat? How could he care about a neighbor's car when he had learned to tell the difference between the sound of a civilian car engine and a military vehicle? The food, which was meant to be a comfort, tasted like ash in his mouth. He ate mechanically, a soldier executing the task of refueling, feeling the chasm between himself and his parents widen with every silent bite. Jake's alienation was distilled into its purest form at the welcome home party his friends threw in the old barn where they had celebrated so many rites of passage of their youth. The air was thick with the smell of cheap beer, bonfire smoke, and the sweet, sad nostalgia of youth. But for Jake, the scene was an anthropological field study. He was treated like an artifact, an object of morbid curiosity, and uncomfortable admiration. They surrounded him, their familiar faces now looking strangely young and naive. The questions were a barrage of well-intentioned ignorance. "Is it like Rambo?" one asked. "Are you going to bring me back a cool gun?" another joked. And then the inevitable, the question everyone wanted to ask, spoken aloud by a drunken friend. "Dude, for real, have you killed anyone yet?" The sound of the garage band playing in the corner seemed to stop. Jake looked at the faces around him, hungry for a war story that would fit into their cinematic understanding of violence. How could he explain the truth to them? That the real war was not the adrenaline of combat, but the monotony of fear, the bureaucracy of death, the camaraderie born of misery. He just gave a tired smile. "Haven't had the chance yet," he lied. In that moment, surrounded by everyone he had ever known, Jacob Barnes had never felt so profoundly alone. He was separated from them by a gulf of experience that no words could ever bridge. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the well-meaning confinement of his home, Jake found himself walking towards the high school football field. It was empty, the bleachers silent, the field green under the gray Ohio sky. He sat on the same bleachers where his town used to scream his name and looked at the field where his first dream had died. He could almost hear the echoes of the past, the sound of helmets colliding, the coach's yell, the roar of the crowd. He remembered the sharp, searing pain in his knee, but more vividly, he remembered the silence that followed, the silence of the end of an identity. He was the quarterback, and then suddenly he was nothing. He realized his journey to the army didn't begin in the recruiter's office, but right there, on that field. The death of his football dream had hollowed him out, creating a vacuum that the Army's promise of purpose had filled. The fight for the medical waiver wasn't just about healing a knee, it was about rewriting the end of that story. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't defined by his fractures, but by his ability to patch himself up and keep fighting. Sitting there in the quiet of the empty stadium, Jake made peace with the ghost of the boy he used to be. He no longer mourned the loss of that future. He understood that that first death was necessary. It had hardened him, humbled him, and in the end it had put him on the only path that could turn him into the man he needed to become. His mother's farewell did not come in words of encouragement or patriotic speeches, but in a silent act of protective love. The last night, Jake found her in his room. She was folding the few civilian clothes he would take, her hands moving with a methodical precision that belied the storm of emotions behind her eyes. She had avoided the topic of his departure for days, but now, in the stillness of the room, denial was no longer possible. She approached him, holding something small in her closed hand. "I know you probably don't believe in these things anymore," she whispered, her voice as fragile as thin glass. "But your grandmother gave this to me when your father was born." She opened her hand. In her palm lay a small worn St. Christopher medal. "He's the patron saint of travelers," she said, pressing the cold metal into Jake's hand. "I just want you to have something to keep you safe, to remind you that there's a heart here in Ohio that beats with yours." Her eyes finally met his, and in them he saw the pure, terrifying fear of a mother who is afraid her son will not return. She hugged him tightly, and he felt her warm tears on his t-shirt. In that embrace was everything: her fear, her love, her helpless anger at the world that was taking her son, and her final acceptance that she could not stop him. Later that night, his father's farewell took place on their sacred ground, the back porch under the cloak of darkness. They sat in silence, the only sound the chirping of crickets. It was Michael who spoke. "At the factory," he began, his voice a low murmur, "there was a man who worked the press, next to me for 20 years. One day he got careless, lost 3 fingers. After that he was never the same. The noise of the machine made him jump. He was afraid of his own tool." He paused. "What I'm trying to say is that the machines we use, whether it's a metal press or a rifle, they change us. They leave a mark." He looked at Jake, his eyes serious in the dim light. "The war is a machine, Jake. You're going to step into it, and it's going to try and mark you. Your grandfather knew that. He fought his war, and then he spent the rest of his life fighting the mark it left on him." The conversation was the most intimate and honest they had ever had, a transmission of a hard, masculine wisdom, stripped of sentimentality. It was a warning, an acknowledgement, and a blessing. It was then that his father gave him the gift. He went inside and returned with Frank Barnes's old military compass. The metal was worn and scratched, the glass yellowed with age. "Your grandfather told me this." "Compass didn't just point north," Michael said, placing it in Jake's hand. "It pointed home. In the middle of the chaos, it was the one thing that reminded him that there was a place in the world that was still sane, a place he needed to get back to." He closed Jake's fingers around the compass. "The army will give you maps, they'll give you coordinates, but they won't give you a reason. The reason you have to carry in here." He tapped Jake's chest. "This is yours now. Let it guide you, but more importantly, let it bring you back." The weight of the compass in Jake's hand was more than just the weight of brass. It was the weight of history, the weight of expectation, the weight of a father's love expressed in the only language he knew, the language of objects, of symbols, of duty. Jacob Barnes accepted the gift, feeling the connection to the men of his family, an unbreakable link of silent sacrifice that stretched from the beaches of Normandy to that dark porch in Ohio. That final night, sleep was a stranger, and Jake found himself awake in his childhood room, which now felt like the set of a dream belonging to someone else. The trophies on his shelf, the faded posters on the wall, all seemed to belong to a version of him that no longer existed, a friendly ghost he barely recognized. He sat on the edge of his bed, the house silent around him, and opened his hand. The moonlight coming through the window illuminated the two artifacts of his inheritance, his mother's small, humble medal of faith and his father's heavy, pragmatic compass of duty. They were the two poles of his existence, the two forces pulling him in opposite directions, the desire to be protected and the need to protect, the love that bound him to home and the duty that sent him far away. He realized the war he was heading to would not just be fought with a rifle, it would be fought with these two things as well, the hope to be kept safe and the determination to find his own way. He stood and began to pack his bag for the last time, his movements slow and deliberate in the gloom. Each item he packed, socks, t-shirts, his shaving kit, seemed both trivial and infinitely important. He wasn't just packing a bag, he was performing the final ritual of severing himself from his old life, preparing himself for the uncertainty of what was to come. The morning of his departure was a blank canvas, the Ohio sky covered in a veil of gray clouds that promised a rain that never came. The atmosphere at breakfast was one of forced cheerfulness, a desperate denial of the imminent reality. His mother made pancakes, the comfort food of his childhood, but the syrup seemed too sweet, almost cloying. The drive to the Columbus airport was the longest of his life, a journey through a heavy silence broken only by the monotonous sound of the tires on the highway. Each of them was trapped on their own island of thought. Jake stared out the window, memorizing the landscape, the sight of a red barn, against a green field, the familiar curve of a river. He was trying to take a mental photograph of a world to which he might never return in the same way. The airport was a shock of normality, people rushing to catch business flights, families leaving for vacation. To Jake, it felt like another planet. The moment of farewell at the curbside of the departure terminal was swift and brutal, like ripping off a bandage. He didn't want to prolong the agony. He hugged his mother first, feeling the tremor in her body, the scent of her perfume, a final, painful reminder of home. "I love you, my boy," she said. His father shook his hand and then pulled him into a firm, quick hug. "Make us proud," he said, his voice hoarse. And then, the hardest act, turning and walking away. Walking toward the sliding glass doors of the terminal was the longest, heaviest walk of Jacob Barnes's life. He could feel his parents' eyes on his back, a physical force that threatened to pull him back. He forced himself not to look back. He knew if he did, his carefully constructed resolve might shatter. As he crossed the threshold, the cold, recycled air of the airport replacing the familiar Ohio air, he felt the final cut, the separation. He navigated the security line in a trance, his movements automatic. Shoes in the bin, laptop out, walk through the scanner. They were the mundane rituals of travel, but to him, they felt like a rite of passage, stripping him of the last layers of his civilian identity. On the other side, he was in a no-man's land, a transit space between two worlds. He looked back one last time through the glass and saw the two small, distant figures of his parents still standing at the curb, and then he turned and walked toward his gate, toward the plane that would take him to the next part of his life. to the war. He was no longer a son coming home or leaving. He was a soldier, and he was on his way to his post.